Welcome to Debt Free in 30, the show where every week we take 30 minutes and talk to industry experts about debt, money, and personal finance. I'm Doug Hoyes. I've got a good guest today, so I want to get started and get right into it. So let's get started. Who are you? Where do you work? And what do you do?
My name is Ian Penny. I'm a chartered accountant, a trustee in bankruptcy, and I'm the president of a company called Janes and Noseworthy, and we operate in Newfoundland and Labrador.
Newfoundland and Labrador. And what I wanted to get you on today to talk about, Ian, was the whole boom-bust economy. One of the first shows I did back in the fall of 2014 was with Barton Goth, who is a trustee who you know and I know. He's based in Alberta, which is a boom and bust economy, if ever there was one. When I had him on the show, oil prices were still very high. Things were still going really good. I mean, as we record this now in late May of 2015, things have dramatically changed in Alberta. The oil price has gone considerably down. They now have an NDP government, which has never happened in that province. It's totally different. I mean, that's certainly the definition of boom and bust. Are you seeing the same sort of things out on the East Coast? Is it a boom and bust economy there as well?
Absolutely. Our economy is very dependent on oil as well, but we're a lot smaller than Alberta. So as a percentage of our GDP, oil is actually a much larger percentage over here. So as time goes on, we're probably going to feel it even more directly in terms of the royalty revenues from oil that flow into our provincial government, but indirectly because there's still a lot of Newfoundlanders and Atlantic Canadians, for that matter, that work in Alberta. And we're starting to see those folks come home now because they're getting laid off. Alberta is clearly slowing down, and we're sort of starting to see a bit of a perfect storm over here. We're also dependent on other resources such as iron ore, for example, in Labrador. That industry is struggling as well. So we're definitely seeing a bust cycle of a small resource-based economy over here definitely taking shape.
So explain to me how I can work in Alberta when I live in Newfoundland. What's the typical work schedule? How does that work? Do I just move there for 5 years? Am I coming back and forth? What's the typical process?
I think in sort of the better times, a lot of the companies in Alberta were willing to fly people back. So you might go for 10 days or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and then fly home for 2 weeks or whatever and have the flights paid for. You'd be set up in a camp or a hotel in Alberta. And it was pretty easy and pretty lucrative, particularly before Newfoundland's economy took off 6 or 8 or 10 years ago. But those arrangements are changing now. They're harder to find. They're less likely to pay for accommodations while you're there. They're becoming unlikely to pay for your airfare back and forth. So more and more people are being, if they're fortunate enough to still have jobs in Alberta, are being forced to move to Alberta.
And are you seeing a lot of that, or is it really the exact opposite, that more people are coming back then as opposed to going out there?
Well, there's still a lot of people that are commuting. I mean, there's still a direct flight Air Canada puts off to Fort McMurray. So I mean that speaks volumes right there. But more and more of these people are coming back. We're seeing a lot of people that have been laid off or are on longer layoffs now, or people that are insolvent with me that have been flying back and forth are now having to come up with money for their own plane fare, which they haven't had to do in years. So they're calling me saying, well, how can I make my proposal payment and still buy a plane ticket so I can go back to work on Monday morning, kind of thing.
Wow. So let's kind of get into the specific people then that you're dealing with. So paint a picture for me then of a typical client that you're dealing with. So you mentioned the concept of a consumer proposal. So we've talked about that on the show before, but why don't you give us the quick overview of, what is a consumer proposal, and then we can talk about some of the specifics in your area. So what is a consumer proposal?
Sure. Well, consumer proposals is an alternative to bankruptcy, and typically it's a more flexible option. You'd likely have a lower monthly payment, but over a longer period of time. The flexibility the proposal offers you allows you to deal with house equity and other assets that you may wish to keep that would be possible, but perhaps more challenging under a bankruptcy scenario. And a lot of these people have challenging cash flows because they are going back and forth to Alberta. There's big expenses. So, like I said, some are fortunate enough to have their plane fares and their accommodations looked after, but others aren't. So even if you're going to Alberta for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever the cycle is, you know, you got to have money for a plane fare. Some people are paying room and board up there while they still have their mortgage back in Newfoundland and sort of sending the money back to their spouse and their kids. So the cash flow becomes a real challenge for those people, and the consumer proposal, I find, just works a little bit better, a little more flexibility, a little bit lower monthly payment. And for people working in Alberta, that's typically where we lean, as long as their job is relatively stable.
Now, you said it's an alternative to bankruptcy, but you also said they're making monthly payments. So why not just go bankrupt and be done with it?
Well, the bankruptcy is, like I said, you typically pay a larger amount. It's based on your income. So as your income goes up and you work more, your bankruptcy payment goes higher and higher and higher. So you're sort of chasing a snowball down a hill kind of thing sometimes. And so the lower payment and the flexibility to deal with equity and things like that over a longer period of time, we just find the consumer proposal works much better for the Alberta people generally.
And so you also talked about things like house equity. So explain to me what the rules are in your part of the country. So in Alberta, when we had Barton Goth on, he was explaining that if you have equity in your house in Alberta, there's a chunk of it that you get to keep. In Ontario, the rule is if you have equity in your house when you go bankrupt, you don't get to keep it. And we define equity as the amount of money you would get if you sold your house. So after you sell your house and pay off the mortgage, pay the real estate commissions, pay the penalties to break the mortgage, the legal fees, whatever you're actually left over with, real money, is equity. So there's a difference between how it works in Alberta and how it works in Ontario. How does it work in Newfoundland?
We're somewhere in between, Doug. We also view equity the same way you do. So in Newfoundland, there's a $10,000 exemption that follows the property. So whether it's held by one person or jointly, there's a $10,000 exemption that comes off the top. You deduct your selling costs, similar to what you described, deduct the mortgage, and that's the equity number. So yeah, if there's a big equity number, and in Newfoundland, just to give you some perspective, in the last 10 to 12 years, real estate values in the larger centers, certainly in St. John's, have tripled.
Tripled.
So yeah, double-digit increases year over year over year. So a house that was, cost $200,000 in 2003 might be worth something $550, $600, maybe a little more today. And maybe today is not a great yardstick because real estate has dropped off the last 6 months. But just to give you a flavor for the kind of increases we've been seeing, so equity has been an issue in more recent years. I started doing this kind of work 20 years ago, and equity in houses was rarely an issue back then, but with the growth now, it clearly is. We do a calculation, take the $10,000 exemption off, and that's the number you have to pay in a bankruptcy or a proposal. So in a bankruptcy, in addition to your surplus income payment, you'd also have a house equity payment, and when you spread that over, likely the 21 months, if you're talking about a first-time bankrupt with surplus income, if the equity number is large, the payment can become very prohibitive. So what we then look at is maybe doing a proposal over 4 or 5 years and cutting that monthly payment possibly down almost in half. And even though you're paying over a long period of time and maybe a little bit more money, it's more manageable on a monthly basis for cash flow.
So there's two elements you talked about there. The first one was the asset side of things. So if I have equity in my house, then if I go bankrupt, I'm potentially going to lose that. So in Newfoundland, I'm going to keep the first $10,000 worth of equity. Anything over and above that, I'm going to lose it. If I'm in Ontario, I'm going to lose the whole thing. So if I have equity, I don't want to go bankrupt. And what you're saying is with a consumer proposal, the creditors are still going to get that money, but I'm going to be able to, in effect, pay it off over a longer period of time. So let's take the example then of somebody who only has house equity. Let's say they've got $20,000 of house equity. So what you would do then is a proposal, a consumer proposal, where they pay, slightly larger than that amount then, maybe 22,000, 25,000, something like that, but they could spread it out over 4 or 5 years is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. So a first-time debtor without surplus income, I mean, firstly, they don't have surplus income, so they're living on a modest income to start with. And then to try and pay out that $20,000 over a 9-month bankruptcy, it just becomes prohibitive because, of course, you have to pay your mortgage too, and most of these people would have a regular mortgage payment on top of that, so it's impossible. So, if you want to keep your house, and sometimes people will say, you know what, I'd really like to get out from under the house. We sell the house, we cut them a $10,000 check, and they've got, a fresh start with $10,000 in their jeans pocket sort of thing. So it's not always a terrible thing. But usually they do want to keep their home, and we can build a proposal that would see them pay, and your numbers are good, whether it's $22,000 or $25,000 over 4 or 5 years. They keep their house, they got a manageable payment, the creditors, the phone calls stop, and at the end of the proposal, the debts are legally forgiven. So it can be a pretty effective tool.
Gotcha. Now, you also talked about surplus income, which obviously in a boom and bust economy is a big thing. So I want to delve a bit into that, but we're going to take a quick break first and come back and talk about that. I'm talking to Ian Penny, a trustee from Newfoundland. My name is Doug Hoyes. We're listening to Debt Free in 30. We'll be right back.
What are the warning signs of debt problems? Where can I find a free online debt options calculator? Where can I get free ebooks and guides? Find all the answers at moneyproblems.ca, the website for Canadians with money problems who want money solutions. moneyproblems.ca.
Welcome back. I'm Doug Hoyes. My guest today is Ian Penny, who is a trustee and consumer proposal administrator from Newfoundland. Am I pronouncing Newfoundland right there, Ian?
You will if you're Canadian, you are, but not if you're from Newfoundland.
So how are you supposed to say it?
Newfoundland and Labrador. So understand Newfoundland.
Understand Newfoundland and Labrador. And we always forget Labrador, but that's part of the province. So we gotta get it right. So okay. So before the break, we were talking about the people who work in your part of the country, who live in your part of the country, but have been working in Alberta. Often they'll go there, they'll spend, 10 days, 2 weeks, fly back and back and forth because the economy was so good with the oil patch in Alberta. Those people who had debts when they got into that situation would have to decide, well, do I go bankrupt or do I file a proposal? Before the break, you said one of the disadvantages of a bankruptcy is if you have assets, you potentially lose them. And one of the assets you could have is a house, and you told us that in some of the big centers, you've actually seen prices go up like 300% over the last 10 years because of the booming economy. You don't want to do a bankruptcy and have to lose that. The other thing you mentioned is surplus income. So give us the quick overview of what you're talking about there. Why is surplus income a problem if you're contemplating bankruptcy?
Well, basically, we when we sit down with a debtor, we look at the money that comes in through the door and the money that goes out. Now, the government sets every year standards for a family of 2, a family of 3, a family of 4, and so on. So depending on what your expenses are, and obviously, we're talking about the Alberta worker commuting back and forth to Newfoundland, but it could easily be a Newfoundland worker who works in Newfoundland as well. If your expenses are relatively high, houses are expensive in Newfoundland. You need a good car because you travel back and forth to work, sometimes over great distances. So your expenses are relatively high. We go through the calculation with the government standard, and lo and behold, there's not enough money left at the end of the month to pay the full bankruptcy payment. So that's where we sort of talk about then, how stable is your job?
Well, so let's take a real quick example then. And the surplus income limits that you're talking about are the same in Newfoundland, they're the same in Ontario, they're the same in British Columbia. They're federal standards, right?
That's a very good point, though, yes.
Which doesn't make sense because I think the cost of living, on Bell Island, is there such a place as Bell Island?
There is such a place.
There you go, look at that, eh? So the only reason I know that is there's a lot of people from Bell Island who come and live in the Cambridge area in Ontario where I am. So I've met a number of them. But the surplus level is the same no matter where you are. So it doesn't really make sense, but nothing we can do about it. You and I don't set the rules. So for a single guy, let's take the simplest scenario here in 2015, the limit is around $2,000. It's actually slightly higher than that, but let's keep the math simple here. So if I'm making $3,000, and we're talking about take-home pay here, right? After taxes, whatever comes off your paycheck that you have no choice about. If I'm making $3,000 a month, I'm $1,000 over the limit, so I've got to pay roughly $500 a month. And because I'm over the limit, if it's my first bankruptcy, I'm going to be bankrupt not for 9 months, which is the minimum period, but for an extra year, 21 months. That's what you're talking about, right?
That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, so if in that scenario I've got to pay $500 a month for 21 months at a minimum, I can't afford that. That's what you're talking about. I've got all these other expenses. I've got, perhaps significant transportation costs. So in that scenario, how does a proposal work for me then? So instead of paying $500 a month for 21 months, give me a rough idea. And I realize every case is different. It depends on your debts and other factors, but give me a rough idea of what a proposal might look like.
It might look like $250 a month for 5 years. It might be $300 a month for 4 years. You really have to run the math. But that's the kind of number we're talking about. And if your same single person there had some house equity or some vehicle equity or a cottage, everybody in Newfoundland has a cabin or a cottage that they wanted to keep. Well, obviously it's just impossible to do that on that $3,000 income, pay $500 to the trustee, pay out the equity and whatever the asset was. So we look at the proposal, stretch it out, much better option.
So it becomes... Sorry, go ahead. So it becomes a win-win for everybody is what you're saying. So if I'm the guy who owes the money, I can't afford $500 a month, but if I could afford $250 or $300 a month, I end up paying for longer, which means the people I owe money to get just as much or more. So they're happy, but I'm happy because I can handle the cash flow. That's really what you're talking about. That's
exactly what we're talking about. And I started to say one of the things we looked at when we speak to a person, you really need a stable job, because what we don't want to have happen is you get 2 or 3 years into this proposal and you get laid off for an extended period, or you lose your job, you can't find another quickly, you start missing payments. Well, then you're faced with defaulting on your proposal and potentially having to go right back to square one and start over with a bankruptcy. So we really like to make sure that, the person is committed to making the payments for this extended period, but probably more importantly, does their job have the stability that's required to be able to commit to this?
Well, and that seems like a pretty difficult question. So I walk in to see you today, and let's say that I've been working, still living out east, but working in Alberta in the oil patch. I'm taking that direct flight you mentioned from Air Canada to Fort McMurray every 10 days. I've been there for a couple of years, but I have no idea if I'm going to continue to be there or not. I assume so, but I don't know. I've got all these debts, and for all the reasons we've talked about, a bankruptcy doesn't make sense to me. I've got some equity in my house. I've got significant surplus income, so a proposal is the logical option, but I don't know if I can commit to a 5-year proposal. What kind of advice are you going to give me? What do I do?
Well, that's a tough one, and it really comes down in many ways to the individual. I mean, I'll support them to the extent I can, but once you miss 3 payments, you're offside, sort of thing with the proposal. So I do have that conversation with them. One of the strategies we do like to use is to try and keep the person ahead in their payments. So if you get a bonus, if you work extra overtime, you got a few extra dollars, make an extra half payment that month. I'll actually structure my proposals so that payments don't start for a couple of months from when it's filed, but I'll suggest to the debtor, why don't you just start making that payment now? You're not paying your creditors anymore. We've got a 2-month window here. If you could get a couple of payments made in advance of when your proposal says you're going to start paying, well, you know what? If something happens down the road, you got that 2-month window there where the payments are prepaid. And if you're able over the next year or so to pay an extra couple of $100 here or there, maybe you can have 3 or 4 payments, you're ahead of the game. And then if something happens, Christmas comes, the car breaks down, whatever, life has a way of getting in the way of what you want to do sometimes. You do have that little cushion built up so that you're not faced with buying groceries or paying your proposal payment.
Well, and I guess you could also, if you set up a proposal to be $300 a month, if times are going good and you can pay $400 a month, that's another strategy to get ahead.
Absolutely, and some people do that, and some people sort of put the extra $100 a month in their sock drawer. I had a guy there before Christmas came in with, it was almost $10,000 cash and paid off the last year and a half of his proposal in one payment. And that was his goal, and he put the money aside. And he came in with the money all in one lump sum payment, and he was done a year and a half early.
Wow, which is great. I don't know if I necessarily encourage people to put money in their sock drawer, because when your house burns down, you've lost your money. But I think, I'm not. but I see what you're saying. It's You've got to be proactive. You've got to look ahead, and that's really what we're talking about today. In a boom and bust economy where things go up and things go down, you've got to, as they say here, make hay when the sun shines, right? So if you're working the overtime, don't be spending all that extra money. Live like you're not making overtime, bank the rest, get ahead in your proposal payment, build up your emergency fund so that when things do slow down, you're ahead of the game. So you mentioned that if you get 3 months behind in your proposal payments, the proposal's automatically dead. If I get 3 months ahead and then I miss a payment, I'm still 2 months ahead. So I'm still good, right?
Absolutely.
So that's the whole key to it. So, okay, well, that's a pretty good summary of some of the different strategies to employ in a boom and bust economy. I appreciate you joining me today, Ian. We're going to take a quick break and come back to wrap it up. We're listening to Debt Free in 30.
Do you have money problems? Don't know where to go for unbiased advice? Check out moneyproblems.ca, the website for Canadians with money problems who want money solutions. For solutions to your money problems, go to moneyproblems.ca. Looking for information on budgeting, debt consolidation, credit counseling, debt management, and debt settlement? For unbiased advice, go to moneyproblems.ca, the website for Canadians with money problems who want money solutions. moneyproblems.ca.
You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Welcome back. It's time for the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. My guest today was Ian Penny, a bankruptcy trustee from Newfoundland and Labrador, who explained that in a boom and bust economy, it's important to be proactive and get ahead on your debt payments while times are good so that you're ahead of the game during the down times. That's the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. I agree with Ian's message, and I agree that if you start a consumer proposal when times are good, it's essential that you get ahead on your payments so that you can handle any unexpected future downturn. That's our show for today. Please go to hoyes.com, that's HOYES.com, for more information and full show notes. Thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.